Percy Bysshe Shelley was a poet who, almost from the very beginning, was interested in the power of negation, the power of what we cannot represent with our minds, what we cannot find a concept for, what we cannot find an image for. So, in this regard, it's useful to think of Shelley's idea of beauty, Shelley's idea of spirit, in contrast to Wordsworth's sense of beauty, Wordsworth's sense of spirit. The best place to make that comparison is to look at Shelley's Hymn to Intellectual Beauty from 1816. Now, Shelley composed this poem during that fantastical summer with Byron on Lake Geneva, and during which time Byron, Mary Godwin, soon to be Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, Clara Claremont, and Byron's physician, Dr. Polidori, were all staying at the Villa Diodati in the so-called summer that never was, because of the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia about a year earlier. Byron and Shelley would spend their days sailing a boat around Lake Geneva, going to various sacred spots where their literary heroes dwelled. They had very long conversations that are encapsulated in Shelley's dialogic poem that is a dialogue, Julian and Madalo. And it was during this time, probably when they were sailing around the shores of Lake Geneva, when Shelley came up with this poem, Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. Now, what we need to note about the poem is, first of all, it's very much a celebration not of what we can grasp, but of what we cannot grasp. And also, it's very much a celebration not of what is stable, permanent, but what is inconstant, what is transient. So in this regard, we can think of the poem in contrast to Wordsworth's Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey from 1798. Why? In that poem, remember, Wordsworth starts off by saying, okay, I've not been to Tintern Abbey in 5 years. What have I lost? Well, I no longer feel the aching joy and dizzy rapture I felt when I was a young man. But even though I've lost that ability to sense nature exuberantly, I feel that I've had abundant recompense. Why? Because now I have a wisdom that has come from my sense of loss. And now, even though I can't experience nature so immediately, I can think about the meaning of nature, the significance of nature. And now nature to me is not simply some sort of place of physical pleasure. It is also an invitation to moral and intellectual contemplation. So he says that now I have a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. In other words, I have a sense of some power beyond the visible. And what is this? It's an emotion and a spirit that impels all things, all objects and all objects of thought, even the mind itself. So for Wordsworth, there's a sense that the wisdom that comes with age is a grasping of some power that we can actually sense in the natural world, and a power that is a kind of unity running through diversity, some sort of stable principle that brings together all the seemingly disparate parts of the world. Now, Wordsworth gains this understanding in the poem anyway by recounting his childhood and recounting his younger days, and ultimately ending with himself in the present moment as an adult. In Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, Shelley also goes back to childhood. But interestingly, he does not do so at the beginning of the poem. He does so near the end of the poem. So the poem is a reverse, we might say, of Tintern Abbey. We see in stanza 5, for instance, that after he has spent a good bit of time, Shelley, meditating on intellectual beauty, which basically means spiritual beauty here, he only then does he go back and talk about how he first experienced this as a young boy. He says, while yet a boy, I sought for ghosts and sped through many a listening chamber, cave, and ruin, and starlit wood, with fearful steps pursuing hopes of high talk with the departed dead. I called on poisonous names with which our youth is fed. I was not heard. I saw them not. When musing deeply on the lot of life at that sweet time when winds are wooing all vital things that wake to bring news of buds and blossoming. Sudden thy shadow fell upon me. I shrieked and clasped my hands in ecstasy. I vowed that I would dedicate my powers to thee and thine. Have I not kept the vow? With beating heart and streaming eyes, even now I call the phantoms of 1,000 hours, each from his voiceless grave. They have envisioned bowers of studious zeal or love's delight, outwatched with me the envious night. They know that never joy illumed my brow, unlinked with hope that thou wouldst free this world from its dark slavery, that thou, O awful loveliness, wouldst give whatever these words cannot express. So the question is, why does Shelley, who clearly has in mind a kind of Wordsworthian journey from childhood to adulthood, why would he begin with his adult vision of intellectual beauty and then end the poem by talking about childhood? Well, I think one key point we should see in Shelley is that he's a much more abstract poet than Wordsworth. He's less interested in time, less interested in memory, less interested in linear development. He's much more interested in the sudden moment of epiphany. And that is more important to him, the sudden moment of epiphany, than going back and trying to find the origin of his first sense of the power behind that epiphany. So here there's this sense, he says, as a young boy, I like to go to graveyards and I like to think about dead people and I like to try to understand what happens to people after they die. I was, in other words, interested in the world of spirit, and I used many poisonous names, meaning for Shelley, I used the names of traditional deities. I used maybe the god of the Christian religion. Maybe I even used gods, goddesses from Greek religion. But for Shelley, to reduce spiritual power to one particular deity is to be reductive. Not only is it to be reductive, but also is to set up a kind of principle of oppression. And this is why Shelley, in the second stanza I just read, talks about how intellectual beauty is ultimately a political power. Why? Because it releases the world from dark slavery. And this is the key point, through its power to negate. For Shelley, the world of spirit is ultimately ungraspable beyond representation. And to say, as, say, a king, I have been able to understand this spiritual principle, I call it God, and this God has sanctioned me to rule you, Shelley would say, no, you're calling this spirit God is only one tiny manifestation of its massive powers. It is far bigger than your conception of God. So ultimately, Shelley is an atheist in the name of God. What does that mean? His sense is that spirit is ultimately beyond any one Godhead, that we cannot call it one thing or another. It is nothing to our language. But ultimately, this is not a reason to despair. Oh, I don't know what spirit is. It's a reason to celebrate because there's always something bigger and larger or more powerful than anything we can articulate. So even the most powerful tyrant or the most ubiquitous religion in the world is tiny and insignificant in comparison to spirit, intellectual beauty. So it's almost like a sense of the political sublime, that all political systems are tiny, insignificant manifestations of spirit and therefore should not be taken ultimately seriously at all. So this takes us back to the beginning of the poem, where Shelley, as an adult, we might say, is talks about what this spirit is like, intellectual beauty. And notice all the negations in this opening stanza. Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. The awful shadow of some unseen power floats, though unseen, amongst us, visiting this various world with as inconstant wing as summer winds that creep from flower to flower, like moonbeams that behind some piny mountain shower, it visits with inconstant glance each human heart and countenance, like hues and harmonies of evening, like clouds in starlight widely spread, like memory of music fled, like aught that for its grace may be dear and yet dearer for its mystery. So, what is intellectual beauty? Again, it's a kind of spiritual beauty, immaterial beauty. It floats unseen amongst us. Okay, so we can't see it. We can't envision it. But then in the second stanza line, rather, he says the same thing. The awful shadow of some unseen power floats, though unseen amongst us. So twice he emphasizes how we cannot grasp this power. And one reason we can't is because it's beyond our abilities of cognition, but also because it's so ephemeral. And then he says, well, what's this power like? Well, it's like an inconstant wing. It's like summer winds. It's like moonbeams. It's like clouds and starlight. It's like memory of music fled. It moves so quickly that we can't grasp it in a tactile way either, we might say. But he says this is good. It's the mystery of this, the fact that it is unseen and the fact that it is inconstant, which is what gives it its power, its vitality, its life. So why is that? For Shelley, what is life? Life for Shelley is ultimately sort of ungraspable energy. And the ungraspability highlights the fecundity, the power of the life. And also, something that is alive is something that is ever changing, inconstant, ephemeral, lubricious. And why is that good? Because if you look at how the world works, organicity, life itself, is predicated on change. So for Shelley, the quicker the change, the more alive. Shelley is very much a poet who is enamored of speed. We'll see that. Now, what else do we want to highlight in this poem? Okay, so we've talked about how it kind of counters Wordsworth. We've talked about how it deals with time and childhood. We've talked about how Shelley embraces absence and ephemerality. But now we need to look at the musicality of the poem. If you read the poem, you very quickly see that the stanzas are highly intricate. They're each 12 lines with a very complicated rhyme scheme: A, B, B, A, C, C, B, D, D, E, E. Very intricate. And the meter is very intricate as well. The first several lines are iambic pentameter, for instance. And then in the middle, there's a line that's an Alexandrine, which is a pentameter of 6 feet. And then the poem pulls back to 4 to 8 syllables, octosyllabic lines that are also iambic. So you have a line like "This world from its dark slavery, that thou, O awful loveliness." But then Shelley returns in the last line to iambic pentameter. So we have 5 feet, 6 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. Why this highly intricate stanza form? Well, we see this in Shelley throughout. See it in Ode to the West Wind as well. The idea that when he is talking about inconstant, ungraspable powers, he ironically does so in highly artificial, virtuosic stanza patterns, as if to say, even the most highly wrought, even the most intelligently put together stanza form cannot grasp this power, be it the west wind or intellectual beauty that I am discussing in this poem. So there's an irony there, but also there's an unironic aspect to the highly wrought stanza. Shelley seems to suggest that no one representation, be it poetic or artistic or religious or philosophical, no one representation can ever capture the west wind or intellectual beauty. But some come closer than others. The more highly wrought, complicated, dense, manifold, subtle the representation, the closer it captures or points to the strangeness and the multiplicity and the manifoldness of the west wind or hymn to intellectual beauty. So some forms, artistic forms, expansive, complicated, so on and so forth, are more likely to suggest the nature of what we can't know the nature of, spirit, west wind, than more reductive forms like, say, political systems or even bad poems. So that's an introduction to some of Shelley's thought patterns based on this quick look at him to intellectual beauty.